Okay, in this video, we are going to learn how to solve equations with absolute value. So when we have an equation with an absolute value, the very first thing you want to do is isolate the absolute value. So in example 1, the absolute value is already isolated. So after you isolate the absolute value, what you want to do is you want to take whatever on the inside, in this case, which is 2x minus 5, and you're going to set it equal to 3 or negative 3. Because whatever is inside here, that could be equal to 3, and then if I take the absolute value of 3, I get 3, so that would work. Or whatever's inside here could be equal to negative 3, and when I take the absolute value, I would still get 3, right? The absolute value of negative 3 is 3. So whatever's inside could be equal to 3 or negative 3, and so we have two equations to solve for this. Okay, so once we set it up with the two equations, it's not hard because it's just linear equations to solve. So I'm going to add 5 to both sides, and I'm going to divide by 2, which gives me 4. And for this one, I'm going to add 5 to both sides, which gives me a positive 2. And that's going to give me x is 1. So when I go back and check, when I plug in 4, it's going to make the inside of the absolute value equal to 3. Whoops. Let's see. So I'm going to plug in 4 first to check it. So if I plug in 4 here, I'm going to have 2 times 4 minus 5. So this is going to be 8 minus 5, which is 3. That gives me the absolute value of 3, which is 3. Okay, now let's plug in this one to check. So I'm going to plug in 1. So I have 2 times 1 minus 5 is equal to 3 after I take the absolute values. So that gives me 2 minus 5, which on the inside gives me the absolute value of negative 3, but when I take the absolute value of negative 3, I get 3. So both of these work. So not every single time, there are special cases, but most of the time with absolute values, you're going to get two equations. Okay, second example. Remember, if you're solving an equation with an absolute value, the very first thing you need to do is isolate the absolute value. So I'm going to isolate the absolute value of x minus 7, which means I have to subtract 5 from both sides first, and then divide both sides by 3. Now that I have the absolute value isolated, right, the absolute value is all by itself, and I have the number on the other side, I set up my two equations. So I have x minus 7 could be equal to positive 3, or I could have x minus 7 is equal to negative 3. Whatever is inside here could be plus or minus 3, but because when I take the absolute value, I would get 3. So my two answers are going to be 10 and 4. And you go back in and check, and you'll see when you plug in 10, you'll get out a positive 3, and then you take the absolute value, a positive 3, and you get 3. And then if you plug in 4, you'll get a negative 3 on the inside of the absolute values, but when you take absolute value of negative 3, you still get 3. So these are my two answers. Okay, we have to isolate the absolute value first, which means I have to subtract 4 from both sides. So 1 minus 4 gives me negative 3. And then I'm going to divide a negative 1 to both sides. And I get the absolute value of 3x plus 6 is equal to 3. Now, it's just coincidental that a lot of these are working out so that it's equal to 3 on the other side. It doesn't always happen that way. It's just coincidental in the problems that I picked. Okay, so whatever's inside here needs to be either plus 3 or minus 3. So that way, when I take the absolute value, I would get 3. So I'm going to set up my two equations. So I have 3x plus 6 is equal to 3. or 3x plus 6 is equal to negative 3, and solve these. So I have 3x, and I want to subtract 6 from both sides. So that would give me 3x is equal to negative 3, which means x is negative 1. And then on this side, if I subtract 6 from both sides, I get 3x is equal to negative 9, which means x is negative 3. So here are my two answers. Okay, the next example is kind of a special case. This is saying this absolute value has got to be equal to that absolute value. So I want you to think about how we're going to set this up. There are two things that could happen. Whatever's on the inside of the absolute value could be exactly the same. So let's say I have the square root of 5 is equal to the square root of 5. So these would be exactly the same. Or I could have it set up where the absolute value of 5 is equal to the absolute value of negative 5. Either way, these both work. So they could be the same or they could be opposite each other. So what we're going to do to set up our equation here and to solve it, we're going to make two equations, one where the insides are exactly the same and the other where the insides are opposite. So if they're the same, we would have this. If they're opposite, then one of them is going to be negative. And it doesn't matter which one you add the negative to, just add it to one of them. They're going to be opposite each other. Okay, so then we solve these two equations. So I'm going to add 1 to both sides. I'm going to subtract 3x from both sides. And then I'm going to divide by negative 2. So one answer is x is negative 3/2. Now for this one, I have to distribute the negative sign because this is the one where they could be opposite. So I would have negative x plus 1 is equal to 3x plus 2. And then solve from there. So if I subtract 1 from both sides, I get 3x plus 1. Then if I subtract 3x from both sides, I get minus 4x is equal to 1. And then when I divide both sides by negative 4, I get negative 1/4. So here's my other answer. Okay, last example. This is also a special case. So this is a special case and this is a special case. If I go to solve this and I want to isolate my absolute value, that means I have to subtract 7 from both sides, which gives me a negative 15 over here. Now, when I take the absolute value of something, it should be coming out as a positive number. So whatever's inside here, whether it's negative or positive, when I go to take the absolute value, it should be equal to a positive number, not a negative number. So this equation here has no solution. This is impossible. So if you ever have your absolute value isolated, and then on the other side of the equation you have equals and then some negative number, then you can't do that. There's no solution.